Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's Object Talk. My name is Emma, and I am the Engagement Officer at the Jewish Museum, London. This month, across the museum, our theme is culture. We are exploring diverse Jewish culture across hundreds of years of Jewish history. And now for today's talk, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our brilliant volunteer, George, who has been volunteering for the Jewish Museum for nearly 11 years. In that time, he's got to know the collection very well and has met with hundreds of visitors in our galleries, answering their questions and sharing his knowledge with them. He particularly enjoys volunteering in our history gallery and will be speaking about objects from that gallery today. I'm so pleased he's volunteered to lead our object talk today. So I will now hand over to you, George.
Well, thank you, Emma, for that very kind introduction. The object I have chosen from the museum's history gallery is the printed image of the boxer Daniel Mendoza, one of the most famous and important figures in the history of the sport. He revolutionized boxing and, by proudly fighting as Mendoza the Jew, he enhanced the status and respect for the Jewish community when, towards the end of the 18th century, Jews were generally despised. Let's get this achievement at a time of rampant anti-Semitism into context. In 1753, 11 years before Mendoza's birth, the Jewish Naturalization Act, obviously allowing Jewish naturalization, caused public outrage and was, along with the Jewish community itself, vilified in the press and pamphlets. It was popularly known as the Jew Bill, and it was categorized as constituting the abandonment of Christianity and civilization. Within 6 months, it was repealed. At least, however, at that time, it can be said that unlike in continental Europe, Jews were rarely subjected to violence. By then, Jews had spread throughout the country and had become a familiar part of society. There were really two classes of Jews. Most were poor and earned their living as peddlers, low-level artisans, and some had even become shopkeepers. Most of this community were Ashkenazis. Inevitably, a few were small-time crooks who were enthusiastically prosecuted and pilloried. The community, as I said, was generally despised and mocked. In 1785, the famous artist and cartoonist Thomas Rowlandson circulated this etching entitled "Too Many for a Jew," showing children tormenting and stealing from a Jewish peddler. One of many such prints by him and others. See also the figure of a second-hand clothes dealer, which was traditionally a Jewish occupation. However, where money could be made, there were sympathetic portrayals, as in the two exotic, attractive young peddlers from the Royal Crown Derby pottery. Of course, there was also the other, much smaller class of wealthy, successful Jews, mostly merchants or city financiers, generally, but certainly not exclusively, Sephardis, originating from the Netherlands and, of course, before that from Spain and Portugal, as was Daniel Mendoza's origin. Many bought grand houses and even country estates. They lived like English high society and were respected, but not liked. For example, the merchant Naphtali Franks engaged England's foremost and most fashionable portrait painter Thomas Hudson for portraits of him and his wife Phila. However, even baptism did not allow you to escape anti-Semitism. Mendoza's older contemporary, Johann, or known as John Salomon, was born into a musical Jewish family in Bonn coincidentally in the same house in which Beethoven was born 25 years later. His father thought it expedient to have him baptized. He came to London and performed successfully as a violinist, conductor, and composer. And he became London's preeminent musical impresario and promoter. He brought the composer Haydn to London twice, making both of them rich. His great success provoked envy, and he was vilified as a mercenary Jew. But he was in fact scrupulously honest and generous, and had many friends who stood by him. In his case, baptism paid off. He was a founding member of the Royal Philharmonic Society, and he was buried in Westminster Abbey. Now, back to boxing. By the 1780s, boxing had been a popular national sport for some 100 years. The so-called sport was extremely brutal and almost without rules. Some basic rules had been introduced in 1743 by the then champion Jack Broughton after one of his opponents died following a fight. His rules forbade blows below the waist and grabbing your opponent by his breeches. But that was all. Wrestling, elbowing, collapsing onto a fallen opponent and injuring him with your knees, all were allowed. And these were, of course, bare-knuckle fights. And again, money was involved. These were prize fighters. The prize money, or stake, was put in a bag which was hung on the stake or post to which the ropes of the boxing ring were attached. Hence the origin of the stake meaning a prize. The outline of the ring was scratched on the outdoor ground or dirt, and the fighters had to stand firmly at the scratched line to show that they were fit to start or continue a fight. This was the derivation of the phrase, to come up to scratch or up to the mark. The words knockout came to signify something or someone special, such as a beautiful woman. In this way, boxing enriched the English language. Fights lasted until one fighter was knocked out, knocked senseless, or was simply incapable of rising to his feet to defend himself. A round lasted until one fighter was knocked to the ground. Therefore, rounds could last a very long time. A fighter was allowed 30 seconds in which to recover and start the next round. The fighters just slugged it out, exchanging heavy blows with no evasive action. So this was the crude, violent world of boxing, or rather fighting, until along came Daniel Mendoza. He was only 5'7" tall and weighed 11.5 stone, that's 160 pounds or 73 kilos. Throughout his career, he always had to fight bigger, heavier, taller men. He was in fact the smallest heavyweight champion of all time, but his image shows that he was muscular and strong. He was able to keep winning because he introduced a revolutionary concept, boxing as opposed to just slugging or battering. He was quick, agile, could duck and feint while raining powerful blows, and then a novelty, straight jabs to the face until he was able to knock out his battered, exhausted opponents. In 1789, he published his textbook, The Art of Boxing, which became a bestseller throughout Europe and America. Now, some try to denigrate his new style as cowardly or Jewish, but as he continued to knock out bigger men, and as his style was adopted by others, he became a hero, immensely popular, and, as I said, fighting proudly as Mendoza the Jew, a cult figure. Jews who had been regarded as a poor, weak, cowardly race gained acceptance, status and recognition as a worthwhile, proud community by many, but of course by no means all. Mendoza was educated in a Jewish school, and at 13, after his bar mitzvah, he was appointed apprentice to a glazier. He refused to tolerate racial slurs and was dismissed when he beat up his master's bigger, older son who had tried to bully and insult him. And this proved to be the pattern for his young working life. When he was 16, a prearranged street fight against a bigger, older man who was exploiting Mendoza's then aged employer was witnessed by the champion boxer Richard Humphreys. Realizing a financial opportunity, Humphreys introduced Mendoza to the world of professional bare-knuckle boxing and became his manager and second. By the age of 20, Mendoza had a long string of victories, including a fight against Harry the Coal Heaver, which lasted an incredible 118 rounds before he knocked out his much bigger opponent. Age 23, in 1787, in a famous fight, he beat Sam Martin, the Bath butcher. He was escorted home by a cheering crowd, waving flaming torches and lustily singing "Hail the Conquering Hero," which of course was Handel's great triumphal chorus for Judas Maccabeus. How appropriate. By then, Mendoza's fights were being reported in all the newspapers, including even the Times. They even knocked the storming of the Bastille off the headlines. Some of his fights attracted crowds of over 10,000, and these included the aristocracy and royalty in the person of the Prince of Wales, who, after the fight with Sam Martin, increased Mendoza's winnings by a gift reputed to be the massive then sum of £500. And he also became Mendoza's mentor. King George III received him at Windsor Castle. Unheard of honours for a Jew at that time and for the Jewish community. One consequence was that Richard Humphreys became bitter and envious. This resulted in a series of grudge fights, very good for business and hyped up by both, with insults avidly reported in the press. As you get in modern times, nothing new. Of course, there were no photographs then, but artists cashed in with drawings, engravings, printed images of the fighters and their bouts. As you can see from a print, in one fight, Mendoza was prevented from landing a knockout blow after he had Humphreys at his mercy by Humphreys' second jumping between them. Mendoza claimed victory on a foul, but this was disallowed. Unfortunately, Mendoza then slipped on the wet floorboards and sprained his ankle so badly that he could not move, and Humphreys was awarded the fight. Mendoza got his revenge in the rematch, knocking out Humphreys in the 65th round, and again in their final fight after 72 rounds. A print shows this knockout. Beating all and sundry, Mendoza became undisputed heavyweight champion of England and the world in 1792. He put on lucrative boxing exhibitions in London theatres and in tours throughout England and Ireland, while also defeating all challengers. He set up a boxing academy in London, and his fame and popularity, as I've indicated, were widely exploited. His image, apart from prints, was even engraved on drinking glasses and, for example, on this jug, picturing one of his fights with Humphreys. You can see from his portrait that he took pride in his appearance and wore his hair long and stylishly cut. Unfortunately, this contributed to his eventual downfall. He lost his crown at the age of 31 after more than 40 exhausting fights to gentleman John Jackson, who was much younger, was 6 foot tall and weighed nearly 15 stone. Significantly, Jackson had a shaven head, and he won in a controversial manner. With his left hand, he grabbed the hair at the back of Mendoza's head, held this in a firm grip so that Mendoza could not move his head, and with his right fist, he smashed repeated blows into Mendoza's face until he was knocked unconscious and allowed to collapse to the ground. Even though he could not see clearly, Mendoza bravely got up for the next round, but was unable to continue. His claim for a foul was again disallowed. Mendoza's life then went downhill. He had a wife and eventually 11 children to support. He tried a number of business ventures, and in 1816 he published his memoirs. He also continued to fight. Aged 42, he beat the bigger Harry Lee over 53 rounds. His last fight was the day before his 56th birthday. He was knocked out in the 12th round. Unfortunately, he proved to be a poor businessman and hopeless with money. His businesses failed, and he had 2 spells in debtor's prison, from which he was rescued by friends. For some years, he was landlord of the Admiral Nelson pub. He died in poverty at the age of 72. However, his fame lives on, and he has left us with a little-known modern legacy. He was the great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of the actor Peter Sellers. Emma, that's my account of the great Daniel Mendoza.
Thank you. Thank you so much, George, for such a brilliant object talk. Daniel Mendoza was an incredible man, and it's so interesting to be able to find out more about his story. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us and for watching this week's Object Talk. Do join us again next week for the last of our February Object Talks on the theme of culture. We will see you there.